Good day, everyone. We'll wait maybe just a couple minutes for everyone to come online, but yeah, thanks for joining us. Our program today is titled Untold Stories of Post-Camp Pasadena. But yeah, I'll wait maybe another minute or so. But great you're here. And then, while we're waiting, our panelists were kind of curious where you were coming from. So if you want to, in the chat, kind of note where you're joining us from, that would be great. We're kind of interested. But yeah, why don't we go ahead and get started? Again, our program today is called Untold Stories of Post-Camp Pasadena. My name is Brian Niiya, and I'm the content director for Densho. So thanks for joining us today. This program, just as way of background, is kind of the culmination of an oral history project focused on this period right after camp, where Japanese Americans were returning to the West Coast after leaving the concentration camps where they'd been held since the spring and summer of '42. The project was funded in part by the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program and the California State Library, and resulted in 30 new interviews being added to our digital repository. As it turns out, a number of these interviews were with residents of Pasadena, California, and surrounding areas in the San Gabriel Valley. For those of you not from LA, that's area northeast of downtown Los Angeles. I want to acknowledge here Susie Ling, a professor at Pasadena City College, who'd been studying the Asian American history of the San Gabriel Valley for many years and helped to facilitate some of these interviews. Would have been great to have her on this program, but unfortunately she was not able to join us today. It kind of struck me that Pasadena's post-camp history is both unique in some ways, and there are some really great stories, but it's also one where we see many kinds of larger trends that were repeated elsewhere in California and the West. So given this, along with the interviews we've done with folks from Pasadena, both older ones and more recent ones, we thought it would be interesting to look at the Japanese American kind of return post-camp story here. Joining me today, we have two people who were born and raised in Pasadena and who have studied various aspects of its history. So I want to just quickly introduce the two of them now. A former editor of the Rafu Shimpo English section, Naomi Hirahara, was born in Pasadena, raised in Altadena and South Pasadena, and has been living in the South Lake District of Pasadena for the past 30 years. She has written about and made presentations about the Japanese American gardeners in the Pasadena area as well as Japanese style gardens in the region, and publications such as Green Makers, Japanese American Gardeners in Southern California, and 100 Years in the Huntington's Japanese Garden, Harmony with Nature. She was also a volunteer with the Preserving Japantown Project's Pasadena team. An Edgar Award-winning mystery writer, she plans to write a historical novel set in Pasadena in the early 1900s, which that'll be exciting. Our other speaker is Bryan Takeda, the owner of Affinity Associates, a small business management company, who has for over 3 decades been actively involved in the Nikkei community. He joined the board of the Pasadena Japanese Cultural Institute in 1986 and promoted Japanese culture, language, friendship, and goodwill between Japan and the United States. In 1996, he established the Nikkei Federation and contributed to community partnerships, development, and youth leadership. Since 2002, Brian has served on the Pasadena Sister Cities Committee, Mishima Subcommittee, and established the Friendship Youth Exchange Program. Between 2009 and 12, he served as program director for the US-Japan Council. And following the March 2011 Great East Japan earthquake disaster, he helped raise over $1 million in contributions for hard-hit regions of the disaster zone. His most recent project is Kancha Pasadena, which I hope he'll talk about in his remarks. which strives to honor, preserve, and share the history of Japanese Americans in the greater Pasadena area. And I also want to note that this is kind of coincidental, but both Naomi and Brian received kind of major honors recently. Brian recently was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Rays by the government of Japan. And just a week or a couple weeks ago, Naomi received the Edgar Award's Mary Higgins Clark Award for her really great recent novel, Clark and Division. If you're interested in the topics we'll be covering in this program, you'll be interested in this novel, which is set in the Japanese American community in 1944 Chicago, where the characters deal with a lot of the same types of issues we'll be discussing today. So the format for today's program is we'll each talk for 10-ish minutes. I'll start with a quick overview of the scene in 1945-46, like right after people are coming out of the camps and into Pasadena, and how many of the key themes of the return of Japanese Americans to the West Coast in general can be found in particular stories set in Pasadena. Naomi will follow with a deeper dive into one of those themes, kind of the occupational realm, and in particular, the landscape gardening profession that drew so many Japanese Americans. And then Brian will talk about growing up in Pasadena a few years later, and about the efforts to preserve stories of Japanese Americans in Pasadena. We hope to have a good amount of time for Q&A afterwards, so feel free to drop your questions or comments into the chat or the Q&A tabs down below, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And I know that many of you are on your lunch hour, so we'll try to finish up promptly in an hour and let you get back to your day. So anyway, again, thanks for joining us, and let's go ahead and get started. So what I was going to do in my time is just talk about kind of 5 key return themes that you see, like I said, in the exit out of camp to communities up and down the West Coast. The first one is this idea of scouts or pioneers, right? That as you may know, once the WRA announced the concentration camps were going to be closed by the end of 1945, there was tremendous reluctance of many Japanese Americans who were still in camp to leave, right? They feared the uncertainty of conditions on the outside. And in that case, many families sent out what became known as scouts, usually the family patriarch, to go out first to see what conditions were like, to inform the decision the family would need to make of when to leave, where to go, what to do. This kind of dovetails with maybe the most famous Pasadena story of this period, which is that of Esther Takei, who can be seen in some ways as a scout for Japanese Americans returning to the West Coast as a whole. She was a young woman, originally from Venice, California, who was recruited by family friend Hugh Anderson, who was part of an organization called Friends of the American Way, which we'll note a little bit later, to test waters on the West Coast in anticipation of Japanese Americans being allowed to return. He secured permission from the Western Defense Command for Ms. Takei to attend Pasadena City College like several months before the West Coast was open to Japanese Americans. She arrives on September 12, 1944. The exclusion orders weren't lifted until December, and Japanese Americans weren't allowed to come back formally until January 1945. So she's really this pioneering figure. Her story is fascinating. We don't have time to go into it in great detail, but there's an interview with her in Densho's archive, and there's a Densho encyclopedia article on her that you can look at for more information. She did recall a generally positive treatment upon her arrival, but there were some exceptions, and we wanted to share a clip that we did from an interview that we did with her in 2011 that talks about one of those exceptional moments where she did face some discrimination.
Oh, there was one little old lady, a famous little old lady of Pasadena, that ran into me at the bus stop almost every day, and she'd call me dirty Jap or something like that, Mm-hmm. And one day she hauled off and slapped me just before I got on the bus for school. And one of my fellow students happened to be there, and he asked her, what'd you do that for? And he said, well, she's a dirty old Jap. But he said, well, she's a better American than you are. Nice. So that's how the students were. They were really great.
Wow.
But she was the only one I remember that gave me any guff at all.
And that's kind of a segue into kind of the second theme, which is that of kind of vandalism or terrorism even. Returning Japanese Americans coming to the West Coast often faced rude receptions that we might today call terrorism even. Many accounts of shots being fired into people's homes, arson fires set on properties, rocks thrown through windows and the like. Miraculously, no one was killed or seriously injured in these incidents, but you can imagine the level of stress and uncertainty that returnees faced, often with their kids and families, walking into those sorts of situations. And then, though Pasadena's reputation was very positive, it was not immune to this. One incident that received a fair amount of publicity came in March of '45, when the home of the noted scientist Linus Pauling and Brian said to make sure you mention where he lives so people can picture that. The paper said he lived at, as a civic citizen, at 3500 Fairpoint Avenue. And his house was hit by this racist graffiti because he had had the temerity to hire a Nisei gardener. Other properties in town were also hit in the Pasadena area, probably by the same person. I never saw any account of whether this person was eventually apprehended. This was an issue throughout 1945. After that, it sort of dies down for various reasons, but it was a reality for many Japanese Americans, coming back to the West Coast, especially early on in '45. A third theme is the existence of kind of support groups. And in Pasadena, there was a particularly notable one I already mentioned called Friends of the American Way. Hugh Anderson was one of the founders. We mentioned him before, along with the realtor William Carr. When the exclusion orders were lifted in December of '44, Friends of the American Way issued a statement. Actually, I think I might have put the pictures out of order. If you can go to the next slide and the slide after that. Oh, there we are. So Friends of the American Way issued a statement. We are relieved that America will no longer banish people on a racial basis. To our returning Pasadena neighbors, we offer friendship and help in finding housing and employment. To the Army and to local law enforcement agencies, we promise every assistance in apprehending criminals who intimidate or harm these loyal people. Friends of the American Way, signed by William C. Carr, the chairman. Members housed returning Japanese Americans. Some helped run the Pasadena Hostel, which we'll talk about in a moment. Carr became well known for helping to integrate previously all white neighborhoods as a realtor. Marjorie Noble, the group's executive secretary, issued newsletters in the form of letters to Nisei servicemen from Pasadena who would about who had arrived and when and who was getting married, who was opening businesses and the like. I was struck by her February 3 letter, which noted that 13 Japanese Americans had returned to Pasadena by that date. It seemed like all of them were actually living in the homes of members of Friends of the American Way. More Japanese Americans moved to Pasadena after the war than had left it in '42. That's, I often use the term return to communities in California, but in many cases they weren't returning; they were coming there for the first time, and that was definitely the case in Pasadena. I think it was the case for LA in general, and I think definitely the work of Friends of the American Way and similar groups played a role in that willingness and desire of people to move there in the immediate post-camp period. A fourth theme that again you see throughout the experience of people coming to California and the West Coast is just the housing difficulties. Pretty much all of the West Coast cities saw substantial population gains during the war as war workers migrated there from across the country. Returning Japanese Americans had to compete with all these newcomers for scarce housing. And then, they also faced a significant amount of discrimination in the housing arena. One solution, short-term, were these hostels that provided lodging for returnees, or again, I'm using the term returnees, but people coming out of camp. And they're often run by church organizations. And there's a notable one, the Pasadena Hostel, which opened on January 15, 1945. Sorry, Nina, I put the photos out of order. This is Nina Wallace, who's behind the scenes running the program. So thank you, Nina. The Pasadena Hostel, as I mentioned, opened on January 15, 1945. The West Coast was opened up to Japanese Americans at the beginning of January. So this is likely the first hostel on the West Coast to open. And for Brian's sake, 301 Kensington Place, operated by the American Friends Service Committee. The director was Sarah Field, assisted by Catherine Fanning, who was also active with Friends of the American Way. And we have a clip of interview with Mary Nomura, where she talks about her memories of being at the Pasadena Hostel.
It was very fortuitous, I guess you would say, that we were in Pasadena because there was a huge hostel there run by the American Friends. So we were neighbors just down the street from this, so we had the support of them. It was a large home, and they used all the rooms that they could to put the people up, and they made arrangements for people to be able to take other people in. You know, they had the Quaker Friends and the American Friends group, and they in turn called people in Los Angeles and let some of the people relocate to the ones in Los Angeles, and it was a wonderful thing that the Friends did for the people who came to out of camp.
And then if you go to the next slide, you know, WRA photographer, thought I wrote the name of it down, but I guess I didn't, came to Pasadena and took a bunch of photos in May and June of 45. And this is a picture of Mary at that time when she came into Pasadena, and she got married just a couple weeks later to Shai Nomura. She, of course, is known to many people as the so-called songbird of Manzanar for her singing exploits at Manzanar and even after the war. So, but anyway, so hostels were one solution. You know, LA also had the distinction of being a place where the WRA and the Federal Public Housing Authority set up all of these trailer camps and housing projects specifically for Japanese Americans. There's a whole story to be written about those. The other issue with regard to housing that you see that there are great stories of with regard to Pasadena is, you know, the breaking down of restricted covenants, Japanese Americans, African Americans moving into areas that were previously all white. And I think we mentioned William Carr, a realtor who played a key role in that. This is an interview we did fairly recently with Joan Takeyama Ogawa, who talks about her family's experience. This is like a decade later now, moving into a previously all-white area in Pasadena. So we can go to that clip.
Not the San Rafael Avenues where all the big mansions are in Pasadena overlooking the Arroyo, but then the hills were more middle-class families, but we all went to school together. My parents, I think, wanted the best education for me, and Mr. Carr sold us a house on Brixton Road, which is in the San Rafael Hills, and he sold a house to Harry Osaki and his family. And my recollection with this story is that Mr. Carr knew that my father was a World War II veteran. You know, he fit a certain profile. He was an architect, a professional. My mother was a beauty queen. I think she was Miss Cantaloupe or something like that, Imperial Valley. But the hardest part for our family was adjusting and being accepted in the San Rafael area. Many people had bad memories of World War II. They thought of the Japanese as enemies. The treatment towards my family prior to me entering elementary school was, I remember these men in white costumes kind of making a lot of noise outside of our house, and they burned a cross in the ice plant using salt. I wish they had just burned it with fire, because when you salt land, that nothing would grow there for a while. So this cross, this ugly cross, was sitting there for quite some time. And I might have been 2 or 3 years old, but I do remember it.
And yeah, you hear, in our archives many stories like that and her story about how her family was sort of picked because they were, they fit a certain profile, the war veterans and so forth. You see that a lot, and this continues. She's talking about a period in the mid to late 50s, but this continues into the 60s even. That there are still neighborhoods that were off limits even at that time period. So in our lifetime, as a baby boomer, in a baby boomer's lifetime, you saw these things still going on. And then finally, the fifth theme, just another picture of the Pasadena Hostel here. And I forgot the name of the photographer. Charles Mace was the WRA photographer who took all of these pictures in Pasadena. If you want to know more about this, in the Densho Encyclopedia, there are actually articles on the WRA photographers. So there's an article on Mace that the late Lane Hirabayashi wrote, who studied the WRA photographers and photograph section. Anyway, the fifth theme is kind of the occupational niche that Japanese Americans were drawn into. And here I'm going to turn it over to Naomi, who's going to focus on a particular occupational niche specific to Pasadena. So yeah, let's go to Naomi.
Hello, everyone. We could go to the next slide, I believe. There we go. It's so great to be with all of you. And I'm going to be talking about another project that was done by the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program. And this was called Green Makers, Japanese American Gardeners in Southern California. And I did this project for the Southern California Gardeners Federation way back in 2000. So that was like 20 years ago. But I'm so glad that we were able to interview people because most of these folks have since passed away. And this particular photo, which I love, and it's funny, I was married about that time, 2000. And when the Gardener Association would call the house, they would always say, this is the Federation. And my husband would, it kind of sounds like the Star Trek Enterprise, the Federation's calling. But when I first saw their albums, their photo albums, they mostly had men in suits. And I said, no, we need men at work. And because some individuals, they felt embarrassed a little bit because it's blue collar labor. We had to go to individual homes and kind of dig out these photos. And luckily this gentleman, Masanao Mac Yamaguchi, and if you're from Pasadena, you lived there in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you probably know this gentleman. He's known as Mac. And this photo was taken about a few years after the resettlement, quote, resettlement period. So Mac grew up in, he was born in Watsonville, California, and he grew up in Northern and Central California. But as Brian said, there were people who came to Pasadena for the first time after World War II, and Mac was one of them. So he had heard a tip that there was this beat up, broken down Model A at the Evergreen Hostel in Boyle Heights. And so he replaced the crank shaft, and then he was set. He was ready for his occupation of being a gardener. And all across Southern California, Professor Ron Tsukashima, he's the foremost expert on this topic. And he had gone through and looked at the various occupation of the Issei and Nisei men. And I believe at one point there were like 1/3 of Issei were gardeners. And among the Nisei, it was like about 20 to 25%. And why? Well, you're released from camp. All you need is a beat up truck that you fix up and a push mower, and you're in business. And for Mac, he said, it was great because you could set your own hours. And many times he would be rushing from customer to customer. Let's look at the next slide. This is another slide of his truck. This is the back side. And for many of you, this is probably very nostalgic of what, my own father was a gardener as well. So he was rushing around so much, he would just ask his customers, please put the check on the clothesline. So he didn't have to waste time like knocking on the door. He could grab it and go to the next, his next customer. So gardening was a transitional occupation for some Nikkei. And next slide. And the Japanese American gardener in Southern California and in San Francisco as well was ubiquitous. And it's so interesting that Dotson actually recognized how many gardeners were out there and created this special truck. But I don't think most of them really use this because they jerry-rigged their own, they're very independent. So they would do their trucks the way they thought they should. But in the case of someone like Mac, the Chevrolet dealership in South Pasadena, they noticed, oh, there's a lot of Japanese, Americans that are buying trucks. And they were smart because they said, we need a Japanese American salesperson. So they hired Mac to sell cars. And then when Mac was selling cars, he noticed, wow, there's a lot of gardeners, Japanese American gardeners who needs car insurance. So that led him to be an insurance agent. And that was not uncommon for other Nikkei who some noticed that there was certain intersections where a lot of gardeners filled up their gardening trucks with gas, and they, they bought gas stations. And so it was very much a transitional occupation. And then next slide. But what was very interesting within this occupation, that there was a division between especially the Issei and the Nikkei. And this is an essay that Dick Honma, a Rafu Shimpo columnist, wrote in July 12, 1946. He writes, but all is not brotherhood in the ranks. Some Canaan ableism is already evident. Competition, fierce now, threatens to become worse as charges of cutthroating and price cutting are being brooded about in the best non-union manner. Disgruntled Nikkei gardeners, fearing that unfair price slashing and underselling of labor will inevitably force them out of business and deprive them of a livelihood, charge the Issei element with practices inimical to their welfare, almost indefensible. The Issei can only point to their distinct handicap in language in rebuttal and blithely go on working for less unless something is done to set prices. So you could see this gap, and this was reflected mostly in two communities. One was Long Beach and the other was Pasadena. And there was in 1955, there was a state assembly bill, the Maloney bill, that required examination licensing of gardeners. And as a result of this, the more English speaking Nikkei, they supported it. And they, in Pasadena, they started a group, the Gardeners Association of Pasadena Area, which was called GAPA. And in this photo on the left-hand side is one of the leaders, Ken Jo, he's the father of Tommy Jo that many of you might be familiar with. He's very active in the Asian American faith community. And to the right is Yosh Kuromiya, who was with the Heart Mountain Resistors, and he later became a landscape architect. And these men were concerned about the professionalism of the industry. But however, Issei, of course, understandably, were very suspicious of the government. They didn't want any legislation of their profession. And I saw that Ko Nishimura, who a high-tech entrepreneur who has led Selectron, his father, Sueji Nishimura, was a big leader in Pasadena, and he galvanized the larger Japanese, especially the Japanese-speaking folks, and they were able to crushed the Maloney Bill, and that kind of started the Southern California Gardeners Federation. So this just gives you a little snapshot of just everyday life. If we could all picture in the 40s and 50s, many of the homes in Pasadena were led by gardeners. So that's it. Oh, it was your grandfather. I'm sorry, Cole. It was your grandfather. So I hand it over to Brian or one of the Bryans.
Yeah, well, yeah. Let's go right to Bryan Takeda.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Brian. Thank you to Densho for putting this webinar together. We really appreciate it. Brian asked me to talk a little bit about my growing up in Pasadena. My family story is a little different. My father was a Issei, so he immigrated to the United States in 1953. And my mother, although she was born in Vacaville, California, she was sent to Japan as an infant when she was 2 years old and was raised by her grandmother with her older sister. So my mother is considered Kibe Nisei. Mom and dad got married in Japan and then immigrated to Pasadena in 1953. And then I was born in 1955 and grew up in Northwest Pasadena. So, my recollections of Pasadena are, I'd have to say that my parents, and I think most of the Japanese American parents, did an excellent job of protecting children as much as possible. We didn't really notice a lot of hardship, in my opinion. We were always told to study hard, go to school, and go to college. But growing up in Northwest Pasadena, we lived in an area that was mostly African American and a lot of Japanese. And we attended, elementary school. I went to Washington Junior High School, which was majority Black, and then attended John Muir High School, which was very diverse. We had Japanese Americans, African Americans, and then a lot of white families. And that was a pretty controversial time because of busing. And so, to integrate the schools, Pasadena Unified School District was busing white students from northeast Pasadena area into John Muir High School. So we grew up in a very diverse campus. And so, we learned to get along with a lot of different people. Other recollections for me are how our community really addressed the needs of our people. We established a Pasadena Buddhist temple. There was the Altadena First Presbyterian Church up on Lincoln Avenue. And then prior to the war, there was the Pasadena Japanese Community Center, which was rebuilt in 1962 on Lincoln Avenue, which is now the Pasadena Japanese Cultural Institute. And so we had a lot of places to come together to preserve our culture, our heritage, and then really meet the needs of Japanese Americans. And we had things like Little League, playing baseball, Japanese American Little League. There were Boy Scout troops, very outstanding Boy Scout troops, Troop 41, Troop 17. And then most of you, I'm sure all of you who grew up in Pasadena, remember Lincoln Avenue. And if you think about Lincoln Avenue, all up along in Northwest Pasadena, there are a lot of businesses run by Japanese and Japanese Americans. There were There were grocery stores. There were grocery stores, Ota's Market, the Lacey Market, Tokyo Foods. So a lot of grocery stores, and there are a lot of gas stations and car repair shops, TNT, M&V, I think it was Bob's Shell Service, a lot of gas stations, and then nurseries to meet the needs of the gardeners. So there are many nurseries run by Japanese Americans. Lincoln Avenue Nursery is still run and being operated. The oldest oldest nursery currently run by Japanese Americans is Bellefontaine Nursery, which is just kind of right here over my shoulder. And Bellefontaine is located still operated by the Uchida family on Fair Oaks, right by Huntington Hospital. So, I think as I think about it, I feel like our Issei Nisei generation really did an outstanding job. They don't call that the greatest generation for nothing. If you think about all of us who grew up at that time, education was stressed. Most of us attended college, went on to get good jobs, professional jobs, and settle into other areas, not just back into the Northwest Pasadena area. Although there's a lot of people coming back to the community, which is really nice to see. So I think, generally, I know it was hard for our parents. I pushed that lawnmower along with my father. You guys just saw the picture, and it was very nostalgic. I spent many summers pushing that lawnmower to help my father, on his gardening route. But I learned just how hard my dad worked to provide a good life for us. And so I'm very grateful to all of the Nisei, Issei, for their hard work and sacrifice, so that we can enjoy, life as we do now. And so I'll put a little plug in, as Brian mentioned, our latest project is Kansha Pasadena, which is dedicated to preserving the stories of Japanese and Japanese Americans in the greater Pasadena area. And, through our efforts, we hope to preserve those stories so that future generations will know just how much our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, what they went through, so that, we can have the life that we do. And so behind me, you can see a photo of a cover of our 2022 calendar. So we're helping to preserve those stories in a lot of different ways through photos, calendars, and now hopefully with emerging from the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be able to start on our efforts to capture oral and video interviews with our elders. So so I would say, kudos to our parents, and I'm very grateful for all that they've done for us. So.
And then Brian, how can we connect with Kansha Pasadena, or if we have materials, or
Sure.
people.
I'll put my email address in the chat, but the best way is to send me an email, affinity2000@earthlink.net, or you can look up Kansha Pasadena on Facebook, and you can message us that way. And hopefully you can help us preserve those stories. And then, working with Densho doesn't hurt either. They're a tremendous resource.
Yeah, we'd love to work with you as we do reviews, and digitization of images and so forth. So, so anyway, so we have 15, 20 more minutes. So, if you have questions that you want to, for any of us, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A tab down below. I want to have Brian just, you mentioned one of the photos behind you. Can you tell us about the other ones?
Okay. Well, I guess this one right here, that's a family photo of the Carr family, the William Carr family, which Brian had talked about. Actually, one of the granddaughters, Sarah Carr, was our classmate at John Muir High School, and so we found this photo and wanted to honor them for all that they did for our community. The one up in the upper corner here is the original Pasadena Buddhist temple picture which the building still is in existence. It's on South Lincoln Avenue. Those of you who know Pasadena, it's right at the curve of Lincoln Avenue. This one up here is the florist, Raymond Florist, and they were located on Raymond Avenue in California, and was run by the Abe family, yeah. And then of course there's this picture here is a couple of Robert and Alice Kikawa, and I think this is a photo of them when they first met, actually, at a dance. And they ended up getting married, which is really cool. And then this photo behind me is the story about 6 weddings and a dress. And so this is one of the photos of Mr. and Mrs. Ogawa, who were the first couple to use the wedding dress. And that dress was passed down to 5 other couples for their marriage. And my family, my auntie and uncle, were part of that story. And then, of course, I mentioned Bellefontaine Nursery here, down on South Fair Oaks Avenue. They're still in business. Go down and visit the Uchida cousins, and they'd be very, very happy to help you.
I wanted to also put on the chat, this is the Preserving Japantowns project, and I'm had been part of the windshield survey for Pasadena. And this was, of course, before World War II. So a little bit different than the topic than the post-war period. But it was still fascinating for me. I lived near Lake Avenue, close to Lake Avenue, Weeder, right? Everybody, there was a very well-known florist named Weeder. Nickname was Weeder. What was his real name? Brian, I can't remember. But all women like my age, in high school, they worked at Weeder's. And he was a character. He was a character. But it was just fascinating for me to walk in places like in Old Pasadena, and even in my neighborhood of the Lake Avenue, where there's a big Ralph's, before World War II, that had been a huge Japanese produce market with different stalls. So another thing that was really fun was we found the house where Rafu Shimpo, where I was formerly, my former employer, that they had, I guess it was like somebody's house, and he was like the Pasadena correspondent. And we went to another home. I think we were taking photos. So this African-American man was suspicious, like, what are you doing? And I think we were mentioning the Rafu Shimpo house. And he said, I delivered that newspaper, before the war. So it was really cool. And he had kind of a crush on, I won't mention who, but it was a Nisei girl. And so it kind of what Brian was saying, I think in certain pockets of Pasadena, there were diverse, and because of racial covenants, a lot of JAs lived, with African Americans, which is.
Yes.
And then I want to mention, with regard to William Carr, I put a link to a Densho Encyclopedia article on William Carr and Friends of the American Way that Susie Ling wrote. So if you want to know more about that story. Couple of questions from Catherine Haney, who's asking, well, a couple related questions regarding the Uchidas. Do you have oral histories of any of them? And are you actively working or gathering older Pasadena and Altadena oral histories today? And I'll throw it to Brian and I'll answer a little bit too.
Yeah, unfortunately, Concha Pasadena hasn't, we weren't able to do a oral interview of the original Uchida brothers. However, we recently did an interview at Bellefontaine Nursery, and so it's still in its raw form. We still need to do the editing and so forth. So we do have that, and we have collected a few photos of Bellefontaine Nursery, but we'd like to do more if possible. And yeah, we are actively looking for photos and stories about any businesses, Japanese and Japanese American businesses in Pasadena, most definitely. Yeah.
And then on Densho's side, we're actually working with Brian on a couple of interviews. We're doing we're in the midst of interviewing Frank Sata now, and if people have other suggestions of community elders who would be good to interview, let one of us know, because we do have the ability to do that. So let's see, there's another question I just saw from Fujio Watanabe. Was returning to pre-war, quote unquote, traditional Japanese American communities like Pasadena better or worse than other parts of California? Either of you want
to? Well, I noticed, because there was a report, right, and about the terrorism that was against Japanese Americans returning to the West Coast. And it seemed a lot of those, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like a lot of those locations were more in the rural areas, like in Central California. Not to say they weren't happening. I mean, you showed the Linus Pauling slide. But it's, there was another situation that I seem to remember. There was a notable Issei architect who, and in camp, and a lot of it, I think, may be connected to the Quakers. And because the Quakers were so well established in Pasadena, I think that they did, color. This is my observation, because I've heard of many stories of people who are Quakers who were also, they refused to fight in the war, and some were even assigned to work in the concentration camps. And some of these friendships were continued. And when these Quakers were released into places like Pasadena, some of them even aided Japanese Americans, back to our area. So, I kind of feel those stories are a little unique to Pasadena. I don't know if I'm romanticizing where I live, but that's just an observation on my part.
And in my research, I think you did see more of the overt racial incidents tended to be more prevalent in rural areas for whatever reason. And, kind of almost as a rebuke to the WRA's kind of instructions to integrate and break up the little Tokyos and so forth, just out of comfort and security, it seemed like right after the war, there was a desire to really reform Japanese institutions and kind of reform little Tokyos right after the war. Maybe things changed a little after that, but I think of my in-laws, who are both, came from other places My father-in-law is from Tacoma, my mother-in-law is from, mother-in-law is from Tacoma, father-in-law is from Florin, but they both end up in Little Tokyo after the war in LA with their families. Because I think there was a comfort with that, and then just the sense of maybe more opportunity in cities versus rural settings, perhaps. But anyway, I want to get to another question from John Sunada, who asks, did the Pasadena Buddhist Church and Christian churches provide housing for returning Japanese Americans?
The Christian church was, they were connected with that hostel.
Right.
You know, the Union,
They were next door to each other.
Yeah, First Presbyterian of Altadena. It was actually, I think, a combination of two different denominations, but they were definitely tied to the hostel.
Yes.
That welcome people. One thing we didn't mention was what the building of the freeway, the expansion of the 210 freeway really kind of decimated a lot of our traditional Japanese American institutions. Right. And I think that's why many of them kind of moved towards Lincoln. Yeah,
that freeway extension, the 210, 710 freeway, really impacted not just the Japanese American community, but also the African American community. The street that the hostel was on, was on Kensington Place, and that's where the Union Church was located. But also, just a few doors down was the First AME Church, the African American church, and so we were all on the same street. And the 210 freeway pretty much took that all away from us. Yeah.
Yeah, and then, I think generally, many of the Buddhist churches and Christian churches did serve as hostels for short-term housing. So yeah, what happened in Pasadena happened to varying degrees all over the place. And I was struck by, they're supposed to be temporary, but, there are places where that it evolved in such a way that people ended living on those properties for quite a long time, which is, again, a whole other story. I'm going to go to another question from Catherine Haney. How welcoming back were the schools, teachers, and school children to returning children from the camps? Sure.
I would say I had a positive experience in school. I personally never felt any discrimination or racism from a teacher. So yeah, I think perhaps I was fortunate. I don't know, but I think my experience was generally positive.
Pasadena it's a really fascinating place because in some ways, pockets were so integrated and others were so segregated. So I think, that's why the Supreme Court mandated that it be desegregated, right? So it's very complicated. But I think many of us, of course, we weren't born, right in 1940s, so this is some years afterwards, but I think many of us have good memories of being with people who are very different than us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in our various interviews, it's a mixed bag in terms of the reception of coming back to schools. But the general theme is that after passage of a certain amount of time, whether it's a few months or a year or whatever, that in most places, the Nisei or sometimes Sansei kids coming back, a lot of those barriers sort of go away, at least the overt ones, right? A lot of other things kind of the less overt kinds of racism and discrimination kind of keep going in some ways. So see, we have just a few more minutes, so want to get to a couple more questions from Ted Tanaka. He writes, may I contribute the very unique, famous name of Reverend Herbert Nicholson, Pre-post World War II, he resided near Orange Grove and Allen Street. And may I expand on his role during camps? And yeah, he's a fascinating figure. There is also an encyclopedia article in our encyclopedia on Reverend Nicholson. He's a remarkable figure. He was also, I believe, part of the Friends of the American Way group too. From Christine Higurashi, is Crenshaw part of the PCJ project? My dad grew up in that area, and the stories are very similar to Pasadena. Indeed, yeah, that's also a fascinating community. We'd love to do something like this for that community also. And you know, like I said, we're still doing interviews, so we'd love to have names and so on as we continue to do interviews, because there's so few people who have memories of camp. So that's one of the reasons we're kind of shifting to this immediate post-camp period, because we can interview slightly, you know, younger people who are mere youngsters of, you know, 85 or so now. Anyone else?
I was going to say, excuse me. Yeah, there's actually an initiative by the Consulate General of Japan and the African American community to share stories and build bridges, and that includes the African American community in the Crenshaw area, the leaders of that community. So that's good to hear and see.
So we should start wrapping up. We're almost to the top of the hour, but any last remarks either of you want to make with regard to our topic, or to plug your projects? I kind of want to ask Naomi about the novel that she referred to in her bio.
Well, for the Huntington Library, I had done an article about the Japanese Americans who were involved in moving the garden that had been in Old Pasadena to the Huntington estate, and it's currently, you know, part of their Japanese style garden. And Toichiro Kawai, I know most of us, there are many Kawais, and one of them actually was the first Japanese American queen, right, for the Rose Parade. And yeah, so I was really inspired by him. He came, you know, in the beginning of the 20th century, and made a really big impact in his children's lives. And so I think, because when you think of Pasadena, we think about the aesthetic, like Gamble House, the architecture. It's a wealthy community, and just the role of Japanese Americans in that landscape is super fascinating. And that's something, yeah, I want to explore in this novel.
But this is in the form of a mystery.
It's a mystery. Yeah, so I have to find a dead body somewhere. I usually don't have problems, so I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, there are many, unfortunately. Brian, anything you want to end with?
No, I'd just like to thank Brian Niiya and Naomi for allowing me to join you today to share just a little bit about Pasadena. As I'm finding, there's just so many stories, and I just encourage everyone. I encourage all families to really research your own family histories and preserve them. Because I think it's better to do it sooner than later, as I've learned personally firsthand. So, and use the resources available to you. You know, if Kasha Pasadena could help, Densho is like my inspiration, just a fantastic resource for our community. You know, and all the folks there, they work so hard. And kudos to Tom Ikeda, you know, for his outstanding work. Just stellar work in us preserving our stories.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. We're right about at the top of the hour. So yeah, thank you. And this is recorded, and we will have a link for the recording at some point. But thank you very much. And yeah, have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.